The Federal Reserve is hiking interest rates for the first time since 2018. The 1/4 percentage point rate increase is meant to help ease inflation, which is now at its highest level in 40 years. Joining us now is Joel Griffith, research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Joel, welcome back. So great to see you.
Hey, thank you, Tracy. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about this rate hike and ultimately how is it going to impact our pocketbooks?
Well, the American family is being impacted already even before this rate hike, and that's in large part because we saw our government suppressing our economy, criminalizing businesses from operating, and then you had the Federal Reserve print trillions of dollars to fund our government operations. So there's no easy way out of this. If the money continues to flow, we end up with higher inflation. If the Federal Reserve tries to rein in some of that lending, well, we're going to have an economic slowdown. There's no easy way out. The federal government, hand in hand with the Federal Reserve, created this problem, and now we are all literally paying for it.
Yeah, I want to talk about also another thing, this shifting the economic growth outlook, lowering it to about 2.8% from 4% that was projected back in December. Break that down for us. What does that mean to us?
For us, it shouldn't come as a surprise. When you have the government involved in so many aspects of our economy and regulating it because of COVID initially, and now you have the Biden administration putting in place a slew of regulations in every sector of the economy, and then you compound that with the fact that the Biden administration is putting in place regulations on our energy sector that will ensure that our supply will be limited in years to come. It's no surprise that now these forecasts for economic growth are being lowered. Families are already feeling this. If you're earning a living, you're probably realizing that your wages are buying far less than they did a year ago. Economists are just coming around to recognizing this damage that's already being done.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about this before. You just go to fill up your car and you get hit pretty hard now.
My little Honda Accord, it's costing me about $75 to fill up, and I really feel for these families that are running kids back and forth to school and work. These families are spending hundreds of dollars a month now in additional fuel costs. And if you're a typical family, let's say you're earning $70,000 between a husband and a wife, this jump in the cost of living is costing you to the tune of $600 extra a month. I know most people are feeling it, and sadly, most families' wages are not keeping up with this jump in the cost of living.
Yeah, absolutely. Gas, and then of course that also impacts your budget when it comes to buying food as well.
Well, food costs, if you can find the food that you're looking for, especially if you're trying to eat healthy, a lot of these veggies you can't even find on the shelves right now, but food costs too are jumping, and with what's happening across the oceans in Ukraine and Russia, things might get even worse as our food supply across the world is partially dependent on that region, of course.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about that and ask you about that. You know, I've heard that Russia is halting its exports of fertilizer, and many farmers here are saying, well, that's going to impact us, and ultimately that's going to impact you and I and everyone else at the grocery store. Explain that to us.
Yeah, so when we talk about growing our food, a big part of that, the reason why food has become so much more affordable over the generations is because we have fertilizer. Our yields are far higher now than they were before. Well, Russia is the world's leading exporter of fertilizer. About 13% of the world's exports come from Russia, and farmers are realizing fertilizer costs are actually up about 140% in just the past year or so. And sadly, we've made matters worse here in the United States over the years because we have so many environmental restrictions in place. It makes us an importer of the fertilizer products that we could be producing here at home. And on top of that, to add insult to injury, our government has in place in the United States a fertilizer tax where we levy tariffs that are paid by farmers and ultimately by us when we go to the grocery store. We levy these tariffs on fertilizer. It's time for our government to get with it, roll back some of these environmental regulations, allow us to produce more of the fertilizer we need. The last thing we should be dependent on Russia on is fertilizer for our crops.
And Joe, I want to ask you this, if you can touch on this. If this crisis in Ukraine, if this continues to go on any longer, how might that impact our economy, down the road?
Well, a big part of this issue with Russia invading Ukraine has to do with the energy markets. Now, thankfully, as a country, in 2020 and 2021, we actually were a net oil exporter for the first time since 1949, largely in part because of the pro-energy policies of President Trump. And that meant that we could actually help Europe as well. Europe is importing a lot more U.S. natural gas, about twice as much as they were just a year ago. And that's thanks to the unleashing of our energy sector over the years. When you see Russia invading Ukraine and these sanctions being put in place and the disturbances of the energy markets, even though we're energy independent here, our allies overseas, because they're dependent on Russian oil, they have to get that energy from somewhere, and that's why you saw these prices surge. And until Europe gets with it as well and unleashes their energy sector and stops their dependency on Russian oil imports, that's a threat to their prosperity, our prosperity, and world security. So
we're running out of time. A big question now, it's in a lot of people's minds right now. Are we heading towards a recession?
I think regardless of whether or not we end up in a recession, which is 2 quarters of negative economic growth, even if we don't end up in a technical recession, families are getting hurt right now. We have millions fewer people working today than just a few years ago. And probably even more importantly, we know that the average family is seeing a decline in their standard of living because of inflation. Whether or not we end up shrinking as far as a national economy, the bottom line is families are feeling the pain right now.
Yeah, well, Joel, thank you as always for coming on. Wish we had better news to talk about, but hopefully next time.
Hey, thank you, Tracy.
Okay, thanks so much, Joel.